This is a great moment. I mean, I personally feel quite uplifted by the extraordinary words of former Chief Rabbi Rav Lau. And now we have to return to the nuts and bolts of the great challenges that we face. Robert Good did a great job yesterday in presenting the operative challenges posed by the assault on Israel's legitimacy, and he laid out the problem in a mere 5 to 7 minutes, and also some of the solutions in an additional minute, and we all got a flavor. Now what we're going to do is to take a step back and to put on our wings, and let's maybe go to 30 or 40,000 feet and get a variety of professional assessments on what the guts, excuse the word, but the guts of the problem are. What is this phenomenon that's called the assault on the legitimacy of the nation state of the Jewish people, the assault on Israel? What constitutes it? What are these alliances, what's called the Red-Green Alliance between Islamist groups and other groups in the West and other organizations and NGOs and the media and certain church organizations and trade unions? How does it work? And in fact, to all those questions, we ask another question. Is this a new phenomenon? It really isn't. This phenomenon, called the assault on the legitimacy of the nation state of the Jewish people, goes back a number of decades, and we'll go into that in a moment. What I want to do first is to share with you this esteemed panel. And I'm here looking for the... Sam, do we have another copy of the... do you have... No, yeah, the bios. Huh? Well... No. Great. Here we are. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we really are fortunate today to have three guests, each of whom represents a different point of view and experience, level of experience and angle on this very complex issue. Many of you know some of these panelists. You've seen them on television. You've seen them on CNN, on Fox, BBC. You've read them, and that's certainly true regarding our first panelist, Professor Gerald Steinberg, who is a professor of political science who was at Bar Ilan, and today the president of the NGO Monitor. Thank you. Which... okay. The NGO Monitor, as many of you know, is the leading group that monitors the accountability of non-government organizations with regard to much of this political warfare on Israel. Professor Steinberg is the founder of the Program on Conflict Management and Negotiation and teaches at the Department of Political Studies at Bar Ilan University. And as I said, he's the executive director, the president, actually, of NGO Monitor, he specializes in international relations, strategy, arms control, diplomacy, and soft power, particularly in the Middle East. His specialties are also the Iranian nuclear program, the NPT regime, the politics of NGOs. Professor Steinberg works with a number of international organizations and is widely recognized throughout the world for these activities. He works with NATO, OSCE, CIPRI, UN University. He's a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. His articles appear in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and European press. And he's very widely seen on international television. Professor Steinberg is going to speak about the role of NGOs. Professor Steinberg, this has been going on for some years now. I mean, this is way ahead of, you were sort of way ahead of the, you were ahead of the wave. You were ahead of the curve on this when people were saying, what do you need an NGO monitor for? And now we understand why. Next to Gerald Steinberg is a dear colleague, Brigadier General Yossi Kupavasser, who actually replaces, in your program you've seen that Raphael Bardagi was to have joined us who was the former national security advisor to former Prime Minister Aznar, he had, unfortunately, a spill and had broken a couple of ribs and could not join us. And we had actually, Brigadier General Cooperwasser had actually been involved in some of our preparatory work, strategic work of the World Jewish Congress. And on the issue of delegitimization, in fact, it was only for the last couple of days ago that we were involved in all-day discussions, so it was a very natural lateral, if you will. And General Cooperwasser changed some of his plans and actually joined us. We're very honored to have him. Brigadier General Cooperwasser is the Vice Director of the Ministry for Strategic Affairs, which is directed, as you know, by Vice Prime Minister Moshe Ya'alon. It is that ministry that it has been entrusted as a sort of the real think tank, as you will, of all the ministries, and entrusted with this whole issue of delegitimization. That is what they've been focusing on, thinking about, debating, outlining, graphing since the government was formed. And he will bring us what efforts Israel is making in order to combat this very serious challenge. And finally, we have Fiamma Nierenstein, who many of us have known for years as a celebrated Italian journalist. Today, she is not only a celebrated journalist and best-selling author, but she actually was given a phone call by Prime Minister Berlusconi, who personally asked her if she, contrary perhaps to her direction, professional direction, would you please join us in the Italian Senate and use your wisdom, your knowledge, and your experience to influence the direction of our country. And she answered the call to that flag, and she's been a member of the Italian Parliament since 2008, where Fiamma has served as the Vice President of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the Chamber of Deputies and chairs the Parliamentary Committee for the Inquiry on Anti-Semitism. And she writes very extensively in a number of different Italian and European dailies and weeklies. For years she wrote from Israel for Il Giornale, the daily newspaper, and she contributes still today. She contributes as an analyst, and she wrote for Panorama, and she's widely celebrated really as really one of the great thinkers on these issues of anti-Semitism and Europe, and now the delegitimization of Israel and Europe, and is always personally asked by the Prime Minister to escort him when he comes to Israel, and the Foreign Minister when they come to Israel in their official delegations. So we will hear from each of our panelists, and I just wanted to open with a few words and say, look, these questions about the delegitimization of Israel, only the questions comprise a longer and longer list. And the problem is not new. In fact, here's a sentence for you, and I'm wondering if someone here can tell me who said it. 36 years ago, somebody stood up in front of a very large international forum and said the following about Israel. Our resolve is to build a new world, fortified, a world free of colonialism, imperialism, neocolonialism, and racism in each of its instances, including and especially Zionism. Yasser Arafat is the answer. He stood up in the General Assembly of the United Nations in a 7,000-word speech with a gun on his side and on his side and an olive branch in his hand, and he spoke those words and received a standing ovation from the prime international organization conferring legitimacy on the international community of nations. Now, here is the through line. The words that Mr. Arafat used at that time were also said in 2005. The date was October 27th. The place was Tehran. Who used practically the exact same sentence as Mr. Arafat used in 1974? President Ahmadinejad talked about a world without Zionism. with a background in English for all the world to see. And he talked about a world without Zionism and without colonialism and without imperialism. Very, very similar expression to what Mr. Arafat had spoken about. And here we are only 5 years later, and we're asking the big questions. How did we get hit with this growing and perhaps some say unprecedented challenge on the assault of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people? Well, there is a very strong tradition for this. And in fact, Yochanan Manor, who wrote the book on the Zionism as racism resolution that was passed in 1975, said that it took 9 years for the Jewish community to really mobilize. The shock was so great, it took 9 years to mobilize. And now we're mobilizing. But what we want to do today is to really understand more profoundly the complexity, the intertwining of the roots of this extraordinary problem that we face. It had said on the agenda that the couple of words that I would mention were de-legitimization as a threat to Israel's national security. And I just want to say that when we use that statement, we use it with two meanings. One, the national security of Israel as an issue of state security, because if we don't have the international community, we can't operate as a state. We being Israel, the state of Israel. Israel cannot operate as a state. Israel cannot pursue its right to deter enemies if it doesn't have the backing of the international community. And clearly it affects our physical security. We know that from the ICJ decision in 2004. We know it from the Goldstone mission challenge to us in 2009. But there is an even more profound point to the issue of the delegitimization of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people when it impacts on our national security. Those that advance delegitimization are interested in breaking up the triangular sense of the self-definition of the Jewish people. We are a people, we're the only people in the world, in fact, that our own historical self-definition, that makes a claim on each one of us in this room for the last 3,000 years, has been based on the triangular relationship between people, tradition, and land. The land of Israel. In other words, that's an unbreakable triangular relationship that makes a claim on us. And the current trend to assault the very legitimacy is just to assault us as a nation and as a people, to relegate us to the concept of a religion, but not as a people, to break that notion. And if we break that notion, they're essentially breaking the entire self-definition of the Jewish people in history. That's the danger. And that's the danger that ends up isolating Israel without roots, without a past, and in their view, hopefully without a future. So, having said that, and the many questions that this raises, I'm going to turn to our panelists to begin to analyze together with us, and we'll leave some time for discussion as to what the qualities are, what the foundations are, what the infrastructure is of this extraordinary challenge that we face. Professor Steinberg, would you join us and share with us the role of non-government organizations in this current challenge, the assault on the legitimacy of the State of Israel? Thank you. Professor.